So often, when I consult in places, I see the over-reliance of physical guidance and physical prompting. And it is to shape or to establish very simple responses sometimes. And when you're working with animals, they do not have verbal behavior. Physical prompts oftentimes do not work with animals. And to me, if you cannot shape novel behaviors in non-vocal verbal, non-human animals, then you have no business working with the most vulnerable populations where we might resort into putting our hands on individuals who may not have the ability to consent to even being touched by a stranger that visits them 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week. But we get that switching to occur without the use of extinction. And the benefits that come with that is that you don't get these extinction bursts. You don't get emotional responding, right? Rats, it's like, connect to the basic studies. Extinction is not an aversive procedure, right? Because we're not providing stimuli that are aversive. However, experiencing extinction is aversive, and rats will actively work to terminate extinction conditions. So if you look at the condition of extinction, our basic organisms are telling us, quote unquote, without telling us, I am going to work to get out of this condition.
Hey, welcome to Cooperant Learning. I'm Kyle Stewart.
Start it over. I was just saying something.
I was like,
you got it.
We talk over each other.
I'm not redoing anything. This is the intro. This is how we're starting. I'll do it. Welcome to Cooperant Learning. I'm Kyle Stewart. We got a really fun show today. A really fun topic. When we first pitched this idea of doing this podcast, these are the type of topics that I really envisioned us talking about, and just getting really into the out there applications of this science that aren't readily available, especially if you Google behavior analysis online or anything like that. So we have Dr. Andrew Bulla here today, who's joining us from Georgia. Andrew, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I love how deflated Kyle did the beginning of that intro, because I had just called him out and told him we needed to restart.
I said, I'm keeping the whole thing. Nothing's going away. Oh man. Andrew, I'll give you a brief introduction here. So Andrew earned his bachelor's degree from St. Joseph's University in psychology with a minor in autism studies. Completed his master's and doctoral degrees in behavior analysis from Western Michigan University, and became a BCBA in 2014. He's currently an associate professor of psychology and program chair for behavior analysis programs at Georgia Southern University Armstrong Campus. He's the consultant for Morningside Teachers Academy and has worked at a variety of organizations over the course of his career, including autism centers, community health agencies, animal facilities, school district, internationally with schools in Lima, Peru. Andrew has worked in autism early intervention, ancillary programs, including social and recreational skills, the assessment and treatment of challenging behaviors, academic interventions for students with and without disabilities, instructional design, and animal training, including loggerhead sea turtles and gray wolves. Y'all heard me correctly. I'm really excited about this one. Andrew, welcome to our show. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thank you all so much for having me.
Yeah,
anything I missed that you want to introduce
Steve
yourself
doesn't
more?
get to say anything that was missed.
The highlight of all this was that he was in school with me the whole time, so you will hear probably more banter than normal because we know each other so well. But
yeah, this is really just for me and Steve to catch up. So if you're listening to this, it's sorry, you're not. We're getting CEUs for this.
I'm suddenly babysitting. I feel like
that's how Jessica felt the whole time.
I told my son this morning I had somebody coming on who was involved in training gray wolves, and he said, "Finally, you have a cool guest on your show, Kyle."
Hey, that's all the social acceptability I need. That's validation enough.
Oh man, and I used my own name there. He does not call me Kyle, but
I was gonna ask, you get one of those family situations.
Yeah, very progressive. You know what? I'm here for it.
Nothing's better than when our almost 4-year-old walks up and says, looks at his mom, says, "Taylor, I need this." Like, what did you just say?
See, his kids call him Kyle, but everyone else calls him Daddy. It's this weird thing that he has going
on. I have
moving
to
moving on, you two. But Andrew, you brought up this topic a few months ago when we first kind of pitched this at you of what behavior analysts can learn about assent from animal trainers. And I was really, really intrigued by this, and then looking at your work and just seeing kind of like the wide array of things that you've done kind of in your career. You want to give like a brief kind of just like kind of like where you're at professionally and kind of what it is you're doing now and like what led you to this topic in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So, full disclaimer, I would never consider myself an expert on assent-based treatments for neurodivergent individuals, autistic individuals. I'm just someone who has seen assent-based approaches used with animals through different models that they've been doing for a while. And then recently have been beginning drawing parallels between that and service providers delivering services to neurodivergent individuals and individuals of all kind receiving behavior analytics services. So I started off in working with neurodivergent individuals and slowly transitioned to doing more general education settings, working with learners that may not have a formal diagnosis or maybe receiving some supports through IDEA for things like specific learning disabilities, and basically doing academic type interventions. And honestly, how I even got into working with animals was because a colleague of mine, Dr. Amanda Mahoney, who also went to Western Michigan University, and Steve, you know Amanda, she was working at Savannah State at the time and partnering with our local aquarium. And as she took a new job, she was leaving the city and actually asked if I wanted to take over a project at the aquarium working with loggerhead sea turtles. And this was a huge passion of mine as a kid, because we would always go to the Jersey Shore. And as part of the Jersey Shore, I thought I'd see loggerhead sea turtles and just never did. So I was very salty as a child every time we went to the shore. And I started just working with these animals with Amanda, learning how to work in managed care facilities with different rare and exotic animals. And that's kind of was the catalyst to even being introduced into the animal world. I mean, I had a rat lab before, but that was really tightly controlled. These were these were placements that more resembled natural environments, so large tanks, enclosures with animals. And since working with that, honestly, it just taught me that starting a conversation with friends can get you really far in this world. So after working with the turtles, I don't know if you all remember what happened in 2020. There was like this like little world event, right?
Vaguely, real vague.
I was I checked out, so I still don't know what's happening.
Yeah, like nothing big happened, but I had a lot of time on my hands apparently. And my buddy actually moved in with me because we're like, if we're gonna be quarantined, might as well have fun like we're in college again. And we started drinking some bourbon, as all good stories start off with two guys drinking some bourbon. And he was like, I forgot to tell you, my cousin works with wolves. And I was like, shut up. And he's like, yeah. I was like, give him a call right now. So he called up his cousin Christopher, and Christopher's like, yeah, we love working with behavior analysts. And I don't know about you two, but when people say like they work with behavior analysts, I'm always like, what do you mean by that? Like, do you mean
Right.
training? Maybe like they had a couple of courses in behavior analysis, or maybe they're calling it, behaviorism or behavior modification. Like, what's the extent? And I saw that this organization had historically had some good behavior analysts there. So with that, we started doing some Zoom meetings and got invited to work with wolves in Indiana at Wolf Park. And then everything just spiraled out of control. And now I'm doing mostly animal research. I took over our rat lab at the university. So our students are learning with animal models, still partnering with the local aquarium, working with different rare and exotic aquatic animals and marine animals. And then doing some dog training and consulting as well for individuals that their dogs may not be doing what they want to do. And it's just been a really amazing time to have this research line and professional line that I wasn't formally trained in graduate school, but it exists kind of parallel to this still gen ed instructional design focus. So I kind of get to live in both worlds a little bit and learn from both of these perspectives to enhance just my overall understanding and applications on behavior analysis.
And let's mention too that you did kind of start out doing the work we were doing, at least during your master's, with severe problem behavior in people in all levels and all types of diagnoses, but he couldn't handle how much he was being hit on by the home managers and staff. And so it got uncomfortable and he decided to jump ship on us. So
I don't know. Maybe it was that. I just remember crying because I was like, I just want to help everyone. And I remember like I could not turn off work. So I think it's a little less cool, but Steve, thanks for making me sound like the man.
I just know that happened several times. You'd be like, this is really uncomfortable. So.
Yeah.
I've never had that problem. I do accidentally set off fire alarms, which is a real story that maybe we'll save for another time. Well, that's really cool. You mentioned the animal model, like in the study of behavior, how that relates to all organisms. You want to go kind of like what that looks like, what the animal model is, and then kind of how that relates to, what most behavior analysts are familiar with as far as, working with behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. So back in 1938, like let's go back in time a little bit, fellas.
I feel like this is gonna be a straight up like Jack Michael, like on page 357 of verbal behavior, Skinner said this, this, and this. So your dissertation doesn't make sense. Like he did that. He did that so many times during colloquium. It was just.
Maybe that's why I have these dates ingrained in my head. But when Skinner published The Behavior of Organisms, it was met with a little bit of controversy because he was talking about principles of psychology as they related to humans, but not a single graph or graphical display had human data on it. He opted to use pigeons and rats. And that was kind of a little bit of a shock because remember, we're coming from this Freudian flair, some humanistic psychology where people were like, how can you relate me with this basic organism such as a pigeon? Like I'm different from a pigeon. I have free will. I have a soul. I have X, Y, Z. But if you look at that seminal book that he published, The Behavior of Organisms, it really presented unique ways that we could begin studying behavior that differed from the norm. So we did away with some of these like Hoolean measures of percent. We did away with surveys, and we started to focus on actual dimensional measures and units of behavior. Not statistics about behaviors or reports about behaviors, but actual natural measures of behavior. And what we found was that I wasn't alive in 1938, but what he found was that by using animal models, there were a lot of variables that we could control that we wouldn't ethically be able to do with human subjects or human participants. And Skinner really fought for the study of behavior to be a natural science and not so much a social science as it was touted at the time. So to do this, we have to eliminate confounding variables and sources of variability that could influence our confidence that whatever independent variable we were introducing was actually changing the dependent variable. We talk about this now as functional analyses. What are the functional relations? What two variables relate to each other? What variable causes a change in the other? So with humans, I mean, just look at our faces. Look at the way in which we talk, the way in which we act, right? There's so much genetic variability between even the three of us on this call right now that any change in our behavior, it's really difficult to say whether or not there was a genetic influence. But with these animal models, we're able to control for genetics, where we can get them as genetically similar as possible, right? And keep them in these environments that we can make as neutral as possible, where we can control all these variables that we can't when we're working with humans or interacting with humans. So when he made changes to things in the environment, it was as close to one change at a time that we could get at the time. So any change in behavior was a result of this environmental change, which really allowed us to study things that we wouldn't ethically be able to study or really contrive to use human models for. And it wasn't for the sake of trying to change behavior for pragmatic reasons or applied reasons. It was for the sake of understanding why behavior occurs. What are the laws that govern behavior, right? And any good science, Skinner argued then, would cut across organisms, right? We look at that suffix of ology means the scientific study. So with biology, right, That's a science that cuts across all organisms. We don't say, oh, we're going to talk about cells with humans, but then invent a whole other description of things to describe non-humans. Physiology, right? Same things. When we look at medicine sciences, a lot of what we do with humans is also applied to those animals. It cuts across. But when we get to psychology, we're like, yeah, there's something different about humans, so we need to explain and invent some other things here because we're distinctly different, we're better. And Skinner maintained that a good science should cut across all organisms for it to be a natural science. So really, the history of behavior analysis is just ripe with animal models to explore and understand behaviors before we go out and start using it to affect people's lives.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we're reading as a group, our book club here, Homo Deus by Yuval Harari. I think I mentioned it before, and it's if you ever read Sapiens before, I think we read that as a group. I thought back in the day,
Yeah.
really smart guy, and I agree
Maybe,
with like.
don't tell our advisor. I don't remember it, so maybe I just pretended.
Yeah, you know the things I got wrong back in the day because I only glanced at, so don't worry about it. But really smart guy. I agree with 8% of what he says. But even in this book where it's talking about human behavior, he can't get past this idea that there's something different, that he doesn't believe in the soul, but the mind is still there. And like, what is it, and I don't think that's something we're doing a good job of as a species, and maybe being able to isolate and show, look, this works the same way. It's just our verbal behavior is here. It makes it a little bit different. So it's interesting how it still maintains, and we've not really made much headway in changing the rest of the world's view of it, just because our verbal behavior allows us to have this idea of the self. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And really, I mean, like, I'm going to get super nerdy right now, but really the big difference is that over the course of the evolution of our human species, the big difference is that we've evolved for the placement of our larynx to drop down during human development to allow operant control of vocal muscles that allows us to produce sounds that other species can't. So like we can still tie it back to phylogeny and then the ontogenetics. Oh my gosh, I was like struggling with this ontogeny as well, of then how we are shaped throughout our lifetime. So really, I'm like, let's be parsimonious here and abide by our science.
Yeah.
Do you think that basic experimentation with rats, especially like thinking like rat labs and stuff like that, like looking across the field as a whole, I think that's an element that's absent in many like programs currently, where students getting behavior analytic education are not actually sitting with Skinner boxes and things like that and working with animals. Do you think that's an element that's missing like in the field as a whole right now, and do you think that's important for behavior analysts to interact with and have that learning?
So I'm going to say this with the full disclaimer that I'm speaking from a place of privilege of having a rat lab. So like I'm definitely biased, and I know that the affordability of those sorts of things, that I'm in a spot of privilege to talk about this, but absolutely. And I think that it ties so well into ethics because so often when I consult in places, I see the over-reliance of physical guidance and physical prompting. And it is to shape or to establish very simple responses sometimes. And when you're working with animals, they do not have verbal behavior. Physical prompts oftentimes do not work with animals. And to me, if you cannot shape novel behaviors in vocal verbal, non-human animals, then you have no business working with the most vulnerable populations, where we might resort into putting our hands on individuals who may not have the ability to consent to even being touched by a stranger that visits them 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, right? And then when we can't shape the behavior and we begin prompting, we have all sorts of issues with stimulus control because people view prompts as something that you do to someone rather than a transfer of stimulus control. So I do think that there's such a need for every individual to shape a novel behavior with a nonverbal organism to see how difficult it is before you start working with, again, these really vulnerable populations.
It does seem like that'd be a good way to bridge that disconnect between, rule governed behavior and then the contingency control. And people seem to just not be able to wrap their head around contingency control so often. And maybe because I took that rat lab first semester, first class I took in behavior analysis, it was like, no, this makes perfect sense. I don't know why you're struggling. And so,
Yeah.
and what you said there also reminds me of our advisors saying, like, listen, if your dog's misbehaving, you don't graduate because you should be able to handle this.
No, I'm thinking back on like reading like old school reports or something like I prompted him out of his chair, I prompted him to the door, I prompted him to, and at some point you're like, you're just using the word prompt here, but it sounds like you're just kind of carrying this guy around. So yeah, no, I definitely, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like the way that you said that. Like it's not viewed as an opportunity to teach. Essentially, it's viewed as just kind of like what you do when you need somebody to do something, and it's often for staff convenience or caregiver convenience than anything else. I think that's a good segue to start talking about assent. We did a whole episode on assent. It was our very first one with Cody Morris. So yeah, it was great. I probably like just a quick land on a quick definition of assent. I think everyone here is familiar, but if anybody's listening who's not familiar with assent, do you want to take the liberty of giving a brief definition of what assent is?
Yeah, remember the disclaimer I gave where I'm not an
I'm
expert on
ignoring that disclaimer. You
No,
brought
but
this up. No,
I mean, there's a lot of different definitions out there. And you can look at not only definitions in the legal sense of someone who is unable to provide legal consent, right? Is someone that we would look for assent. So you have like legal definitions. There's been some camps within the field that are doing concept analyses of looking at the critical features of what assent is. So you have kind of the constructional approach where they're looking at degrees of freedom and having 2 or more degrees of freedom in terms of opportunities for reinforcement. The more degrees you have, the truer it is to assent. And then you have others that have done assent-based work for a long time in the field, such as Michael Fabrizio, Kelly Ferris, the company from, or the folks from ORL. So there's a lot of variability within that. To me, assent is something that is not obtained. It's something that is measured throughout. That I don't just ask a child, do you want to do this? And then if they say yes, continue to do it, right? It's something that is continuously measured when you're working with an organism, and you're looking for indicators of when an organism is engaging in behaviors that are indicative of a stressful environment in which they are trying to engage in behaviors reinforced by negative reinforcement to get some relief from that aversive environment, that we then prescribe the label of they're not willing to participate anymore, right? But it's basically, to me, being really good at identifying these escape and avoidance maintain behaviors early on, right? And then respecting when someone opts out of something or the environment that's currently provided. And assent is gained when we look at approaches and opt-in behaviors to it, whatever it is that we're doing. And again, please don't make that the official definition, right? But I think that this gives us some variability in the way in which we talk about it. And we're not saying any one person is right. It's really the conditions under which one definition makes the most sense, and really looking at the conditions under which we take assent-based approaches, and don't cancel me for this, and those conditions under which an assent-based approach cannot occur, such as if your child is going to drink bleach, you're not going to let them assent into that, right? That there are conditions under which should function as an S delta of, yep, I'm going to engage in looking for ongoing assent.
Yeah. Just to save you a little bit too, I looked up the definition while you were talking. Just to
Great. Let's
I,
go with that one.
the Oxford Dictionary says an expression of approval or agreement. And so, like you're saying, what we're looking for is any sign of discomfort, displeasure, anything that would say, hey, listen, this, and in your case, organism, it may or may not be a person, is no longer cool with what we're doing in general. There's some sign that something isn't going on here. And what we talked about a lot with that episode with Cody is in our work, we're often hired to change behavior where, the organism, the person does not want to change their behavior. It's very effective for them, but there's a court, there's legally someone somewhere saying, nope, this has to be addressed. And I'd assume that doesn't happen as much in the animal world, except maybe if you're trying to save a life, maybe, and not you necessarily, but someone's trying to save a life of an animal that may go through be euthanized otherwise, or something along that line.
Yeah. I mean, I think like a lot of times, when you look at some managed care facilities, they don't take assent-based approaches where they'll just put the animal under anesthesia and then do these medical procedures, where we're seeing we don't have to put animals unnecessarily through anesthesia to get the same outcomes of these medical procedures.
So I can think of a couple pretty effective ways that a wolf might like revoke assent, but trying to think of what this might actually look like. So you talked about in our notes the Lima principles. Am I saying that right?
Lima.
Oh, Lima. Okay, so least intrusive, minimally aversive. So, does that tie into? I mean, do you want to go over that concept? And does that tie into? I basically just want to know how, working with wolves, you can ask them, do they want to do something or not? So,
Yeah, so I think Lima principles are a really good place to start that animal trainers have been using for a while. There's a lot of debates within the animal training field that I wasn't aware of, such as how much do you do respondent-based conditioning procedures versus operant-based conditioning procedures. There's this thing called balance training that looks at real world contingencies, and it's a balance between punishment and reinforcement. So you have some trainers that opt into doing balance-based approaches, and then you have individuals that follow these Lima principles, which are least intrusive and minimally aversive. And I remember talking to Susan Friedman about this, and she is a fantastic behavior analyst that does applied animal behavior work. And really, it gives us these ideas of what types of strategies are more aversive than others, and what do we have to make sure that we rule out beforehand before we kind of move up this hierarchy of interventions. And it says minimally aversive, right? So there are times when negative reinforcement is more aligned with an assent-based approach than using positive reinforcement only. So we can think of, before you begin changing an animal's behavior under these Lima-based principles, what's their wellness, right? Are they like, what's their overall wellness in terms of nutritional wellness, in terms of physical wellness? Kind of like in the applied field, you do a medical rule out, right? But we're going to look at these underlying physiological things first to make sure that at the most basic level, needs are being met. Then as we move up to kind of getting more invasive, we can look at antecedent arrangements. So I'm a huge antecedent arrangement and environmental enrichment, and looking at things that occur prior to the behavior that we can change, right? And that's going to be less aversive. Moving up the hierarchy, we can have things like positive reinforcement, right? So a strictly positive reinforcement based approach. Going a little bit more aversive or kind of getting more intrusive would be things like differential reinforcement procedures of alternative behaviors, where we're using either extinction, or some of the work we've been doing in our lab is DRA, or differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors without extinction. So looking at modifying the quality of reinforcement, degrading the quality, the magnitude. So doing some kind of reinforcer manipulation where the behavior is still being reinforced, but we're changing something about the reinforcer, which establishes switching behaviors to the alternative. Going up, we have pure extinction, negative reinforcement, negative punishment gets more intrusive and aversive. And then last but not least, last default is positive punishment. And a truly assent-based positive approach would eliminate kind of those aversives of using punishment, negative reinforcement, and extinction in and of itself. So in general, that's what we're talking about in Lima principles, where we try not to get to that point of using more aversive procedures.
I feel like I say this every other episode, but I really don't think that we do enough of that, altering the magnitudes of the quality of the reinforcement to change behavior without extinction. Like, extinction most of the time seems to be relatively unnecessary if you really have good control over the environment. And I don't see or hear about people using that to their advantage much at all.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that, again, we're afforded to do in our rat lab, where we can set up concurrent schedules of reinforcement. Quality, the magnitude, something about the reinforcer, that the target behavior is still being reinforced, right? But we get that switching to occur without the use of extinction. And the benefits that come with that is that you don't get these extinction bursts. You don't get emotional responding, right? Rats, it's like, connect to the basic studies. Extinction is not an aversive procedure, right? Because we're not providing stimuli that are aversive. However, experiencing extinction is aversive, and rats will actively work to terminate extinction conditions. So if you look at the condition of extinction, right, our basic organisms are telling us, quote unquote, without telling us, I am going to work to get out of this condition.
I mean, that is something whenever I'm supervising a new student or someone that's going to sit for the exam, I just take them out of their comfort zone a little bit. I'm like, all right, explain to me whether we are truly reinforcing this behavior with this reinforcer, or if the organism is just avoiding the aversive condition of not receiving the reinforcer. I mean, the reaction from the organism is the same, but you can almost see the discomfort, to use a mentalistic term, like the aggravation, the anger, signs. And so it almost functions the same way, even though we would just categorize it as reinforcement.
And thinking like old school mentality too. I mean, I've been in the field for over a decade now, and just remembering some of those like early on like clinic days. So I would see what I know now was that emotional responding in like extinction procedures, and that was like, this is just like the hard thing you got to get through before the breakthrough. You know what I mean? And not really, some of those like old school behavior analysts kind of talking about, it's hard before it gets better, and really having to reframe that over the last decade of just like, it doesn't actually need to be that wildly difficult for the individual to go through in order to learn effectively.
Now let me ask you both, like, what happens when we expose individuals to extinction conditions, and let's say just human individuals. What sorts of things do we typically see?
There's, like you said, the burst, the increase of aggravation. I always flip to the other side. Then the person, again, in the natural environment, who's using extinction to their benefit, seems to get some level of reinforcement from seeing those signs of aggravation too, as well. And I always try to tell anyone I'm working with outside of our field, like, if you feel good about how someone else is reacting and it's not in a positive manner, then you're being reinforced by that reaction, and you need to make sure what you're doing is only for how it's affecting their behavior and not how it makes you feel. Like punishment, extinction, any of those things. We did a episode on the Doc Analyzes Anything on punishment, just for society to hear and understand. It's like, there's nothing necessarily wrong with punishment. There's reasons not to use it. There's some downsides to it. But if you find you're doing it because it's reinforcing to you, not because you're trying to decrease that behavior, that's when there's a problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like that's the issue to me.
absolutely. And the point that you bring up is like, there's a lot that goes into extinction. And typically the clients that we're working with, they do show that, like you said, like that emotional, like they're crying, they're screaming, right? We see that extinction can induce aggression. Okay. We see that the magnitude of the behavior will go up, the frequency of the behavior, all of these things. And you know what? For a long time, it's like, okay, we have to put safeguards in, and we're going to do it anyway. You want to know why? Because we're not afraid that we're going to die as the behavior change agents. You go ahead and tell me you're going to deal with an extinction burst from a lion, from an elephant, from a giraffe, from a tiger, from a wolf. And immediately it's like, well, no, I would never do that because I could get killed. Well, yeah, you can. So if we found ways that we can change behaviors in those sorts of organisms without using extinction and getting the same outcomes, then why is it so quickly that we default to using extinction with 3-year-olds, where we can dominate them and we're not afraid of getting hurt? And we say, well, we can tolerate this because we're not in danger. And when I look at it through that lens, it's like, holy moly, like, other people are doing this. without these types of aversive procedures that cause this level of emotional responding. Okay. But we do it because we're bigger oftentimes than the clients that we serve.
Well, some of the cases we work with, you could be killed potentially if you try to do it. And that's what we hear a lot in homes. Like, we can't do this. We cannot follow this extinction procedure. And so that's why we almost were forced to early on learn and develop new ways to address it, because they just weren't going to follow the plan if it was going to, create that level of agitation.
100%.
You're right that suddenly it's a lot more compelling to know less restrictive means of promoting behavior change when you're working with like a big animal, for example, who could harm you in some way. Like, oh no, I'm willing to learn, a positive reinforcement or antecedent manipulation at this point because, I don't want to make this thing mad.
I will say I have the irrational belief that I could take on a black bear. Like a grizzly, no way, but irrational belief that.
But like, why did
That's
you
for
want?
another episode.
Oh no,
You're so sweet. I'm like, I see a black bear and I'm like, oh, you're so
well,
sweet.
really,
I'm
what
like,
it is
"You're
it
so
looks
scared."
soft and cuddly. I want to hug it, and then when it
Yeah.
gets aggravated with me, then I have to.
Exactly.
Andrew, we talked a little bit about how you've worked with gray wolves and other animals. Do you want to talk about some of the work that you actually did? I was reading some of the studies on like discrimination training, matching to sample, things like that. But what kinds of things were you doing with the wolves in the Hoosier State where I hang out and live, and Steve always makes fun of me for?
Hey, I was at the Hoosier ABBA not too long ago talking about this too. Indiana is where it's at.
I used to be a board member there, so shout out to
Hey,
Haba.
brother. Yeah. So one thing that kind of inspires some of my work is something that Catania said was, we can do these investigations between humans and animals. And once we start to look at things that only humans can do that animals can't, then we begin to understand what makes us uniquely human versus something else. Right. So a lot of what my lab was looking at with this study with wolves was, can wolves learn conceptual behavior? Okay. And what I like that Susan Friedman, she's fantastic. She said to me one time, and it really stuck with me, a lot of the questions that we're asking in research, we already know that the animals can do because we see it through naturalistic and descriptive observations. Yes, wolves learn concepts. Concept is stimulus control, where a class of stimuli will evoke a common response. Rather than one specific stimulus evoking one response, conceptual control emerges when a stimulus class that has members that share features with one another that may physically be dissimilar from one another, but regardless, those critical features will still evoke the same common response. So, for example, wolves learn concepts of pack member versus non-pack member. They're able to discriminate wolves that belong to the pack as examples and wolves that do not belong to the pack as non-examples. They learn to discriminate the concept of food versus non-food, territory that's theirs versus territory that's another pack. And you can look through these descriptive data of wolves staying within the boundaries of territory that their pack is responsible for versus others. So it's not that we don't know if wolves can learn concepts, right? They can. But we're trying to study what are the conditions under which these concepts come about. So we set out to do a study that looked at if we train wolves on one set of stimuli, that we systematically vary different features, but kept those critical features salient, can they then engage in the same response with novel, never before trained stimuli that contain those features? So we did shapes. So circles, it was a circle. No, it was not a circle. I lied. A square, a triangle, and a cross. Because we tried to do a circle, but we couldn't cut it with the saw perfectly. And we're like, all right, let's do a cross. Straight lines only. And we varied those shapes in terms of size, color, spatial orientation. Okay. And we had our training set where we had 3 different examples of each of those stimuli. And then we probed for generative responding to see if the animal can engage in the same response in the presence of novel stimuli that they'd have no reinforcement history with. So we set out to do that as an exploratory study. And basically, you all know the hubbub about training, right? Discrimination training involves an extinction component where, no reinforcement in the presence of the S delta and reinforcement in the presence of the SD. Okay, well, again, I'm not dealing with an extinction burst from a wolf. So let's figure out now how we can blend this assent-based treatment and those Lima-based principles into the design of this study so we can answer the question while keeping the animals, and I'm going to say happy. I don't care if y'all judge me, it's mentalistic, but keeping them happy, keeping them calm, engaged, and willing, and doing what we can to arrange an environment that's not stressful, that may evoke some avoidance behavior, as well as elicit some really not so pleasant reflexive or respondent behaviors. And we want to do this not only for the benefit of the researchers, but to the benefit of the organism for which we're learning from. So it took us a while. We use an errorless training approach where we systematically increase the stimulus set from 1 to 2 to 3. We always provided negative reinforcement on a continuous schedule. So we taught an opt-in response where anytime the wolf stationed on the station mound, which was a blue cement square, that actually initiated the trial. So every trial that we did was, we commenced it once the wolf gave that opt-in behavior. And then any reinforcer delivery was always yoked with negative reinforcement. So what I mean by that is we would deliver positive reinforcers with pepperoni, sausage, cheese, everything that Steve loves. I mean, the wolves love, right? So we use pepperoni, cheese, sausage as the positive reinforcer, but we provided negative reinforcement by taking that and throwing it behind the station mound. So the wolf was able to get temporary negative reinforcement from avoiding the training condition. And then the next trial would not commence again until the wolf restarted and went on that opt-in square. So we always gave them negative reinforcement, and that was always an option. So we were able to kind of build this relationship with these wolves where the risk for an extinction burst really decreased because of the way in which we arranged our environment and the procedures that we were using.
I'm guessing a couple research assistants losing fingers helped with the throwing decision as well.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm very thankful. This is actually, I wasn't allowed to do the training with the wolves alone. And I did this a lot via telecommunication because you have to be certified in the emergency procedures in terms of wolf restraints. There always had to be a backup in the enclosure with the researcher in case something happened. And it really limited too that we had to have one hand or hands always available. So things like clicker training, I can't use a clicker in case something happens. I need to have my hands free. So we used auditory click with our tongue to reinforce. So again, some of these arrangements that we're promoting the safety of the staff. We had Kaz Brooks, Ryan Talbot. They were absolutely fantastic. That they were safe, as well as the animals were safe and didn't actively work to get out of the enclosure.
I like the idea of using the concept formation like this, just because people, I think as a whole, tend to think that it requires verbal behavior. And I think it was one of the first things I, like early on grad school, I was in a class, we're talking about concept formation, and basically it was the passage of time as an SD, and like they don't have a clock. There's no timer there. Becomes a warning stimulus that you're going to miss out on reinforcement, but there is no way for them to tell time, and you can't find a way to describe it other than a concept formation of basically trial and error. Wait too long, didn't wait long enough, and they hone in on it. And I'll call my wife Taylor out since she's listening on from another side as an audience member here. She loves to brag about setting the oven and how good she is at going in within like 10 seconds of the timer going off, just because of that same sort of contingency control concept formation, but it doesn't revolve that verbal behavior, that rule governance. And so it's cool to be able to show that from the animal side, because people tend to think, nope, you need verbal behavior for that.
Yeah, and you don't. I'm
No.
with you. I'm so glad you brought that up, Steve, because pigeons, they can discriminate between good art and bad art. There's a fun study that we read where pigeons will actively identify and peck at good art. So like
I
art that
cannot.
versus not good art, like art that Kyle would draw. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I cannot tell the difference. Everybody can see Einstein behind me, and that's the only art I have just because a friend of the family gave it to me and I thought it was cool, but I have no idea.
That going back to that blue square in that formation too. I mean, that's kind of your measure of the wolf's assent in that at least willingness to begin a trial, essentially, right?
Exactly. So like the
Assumption, is that
opt-in
correct?
response. So like how can
Yeah.
this then be applied to the professional practice of behavior analysis? Ask yourself the question, what do my learners do to indicate that they're willing and ready to work for me? And with me, not for me, sorry, with me. It is a relationship between you and your learner. So what are you actively looking for that the learner is confidently saying, I'm ready? All right. And so just ponder, whoever's listening to this, if it's no one, you're lucky because I'm rambling. If it's one person and that changes something that you do, then I'm really proud of the outcome of that, because so often we jump in, we power through, right? And it's like, well, did we teach the learner how to opt in? And in the same vein, we teach our animals how to opt out. When I did some training with my dog to put on his, the cone of shame. And I always had my hand out as a touch cue, that anytime my dog would touch his nose on my hand, he got out of the task. So he would touch it, it would remove the cone, and he could walk away until he then opted into doing cone training again, to get him to put the cone on manually so I don't have to wrestle him and put it on. So what are the opt-out responses? In behavior analysis in the professional field, that's kind of where we focus with FCT training. We train in FCR for escape maintained behaviors. But is that really enough, right? Are we doing that opt-in response to then have them, okay, when are you ready then to commence? And what am I doing to rearrange the environment so you opt in more than you opt out?
That's the clip right there. That was wonderfully put.
Boom. I was like, all right, I gotta go. And I'm just kidding. I'm
Yeah,
opting
just
out.
drop it. Just drop it. I've got nothing else.
We'll send you a mic so you can pick it up and drop it right there.
Drop the proverbial mic.
I
No, but
I will say,
we do. Sorry, Steve, but we do know the power of choice as both an antecedent condition and as a reinforcer. I mean, a lot of times people, given two different conditions, will opt for the choice condition even when they get the same reinforcer that they got in the non-choice condition, right?
Yep.
So yeah, really just powerful. You know, just speaking to autonomy and dignity, and yeah, everything you're saying is just really, yeah. I just like it. I just like what you're saying.
it really makes me cringe just to think about all the times where someone suggested using escape extinction to get compliance in the center-based type situation too. Like, just prompt them through it. They'll start working with you again in a minute, and like, it is quite cringe-worthy just to even think about that when this is the alternative, you know?
Yeah. And it takes a while to learn and get good at these things. Like, it's not easy. And I look back at my own professional career and the amount of times I used extinction unnecessarily. I did it. I look back at my career and I look at things that I did that I would never do again. And I can spiral and say things like, or I can crash out, as the kids are saying now. I can crash out and say like, oh my God, I harmed this child, right? But I was doing the best that I could with the current repertoire and the environmental arrangements I had. So it was kind of like this idea that the rat is always right. Like, I was doing the best. But as we continue to progress as any science, you know, things can change. And what is best today can be true. And then because we're a pragmatic science, 10 years from now cannot be true. And we find things that are truer. And I'm just really excited that these kind of conversations are happening, because this is something now that I would never have done had I not worked with animals, right? Most often gen ed kids, like the kids that I'm working with, can't read. So I'm like, do you want to learn to read? And they're like, yes. Okay, sweet. Right. But I look back and like, I just hope that if anyone's like, oh, I'm relying on extinction, or they're feeling like, why didn't I think about this before? Like, give yourself some grace and think, wow, I was doing the best that I could with the information repertoire that I had, and I'm now doing the best that I can to extend my repertoire and expand my repertoire to better serve clients that incorporates more of these things of giving autonomy. And like that is what I'm really excited about. And it's also a call for folks like me in academia that there are things that are progressing faster than what the literature supports. And I'm going to say that, and I hope this doesn't offend anyone. I'm trying to be sincere here. There are things that animal trainers have been doing that are really effective, but aren't empirically validated or experimentally studied. Okay. And then there are things that we then do in the field that revolve around these things that have not been experimentally or empirically shown to be better. And that is a call for academics to walk hand in hand with people that are doing these things and really begin to evaluate questions, some comparative studies, looking at minimizing some of these emotional level responses, measuring physiological responses at the respondent level that may be occurring, right? What are we doing in academia to answer some of these research questions? And I find that, I get a lot more done in my research productivity when I'm walking hand in hand with my collaborators than when I'm demanding that they do what I do. And so I'm really excited to see this research is being used, or we're doing research to begin to demonstrate experimentally and empirically, because we have to remember that evidence-based practice is a thing. And we have to remember that we can't make claims that something is better than something else unless we have the data to show it. Both inductive data based on observations and deductive data based on the available literature that we can form new hypotheses. And so I'm arguing for both.
I think it's a good point too, that when people are doing things, and sure, there is such thing as, superstitious behavior, things that just get reinforced that don't make sense. Like, I just haven't changed my underwear in a week, so I say it's because I've had a good week. But
That's the
no,
clip right there.
yeah, that's it right there.
You know what? That is your choice. Assent.
But if practices maintain and we don't have a way to make them more effective yet, then why those practices maintained should be studied. That they're working for the animal trainers, they're working in these other fields. So let's study why they are, and then can we improve upon that scientifically beyond that, rather than say, nope, let's just do things our way. It makes a lot of sense that it wouldn't maintain if it wasn't reinforced somehow.
Yeah. Like, honestly, I don't know if teaching an opt-in response produces better outcomes long-term in terms of just skill acquisition and the repertoires we establish. But I know I feel a lot better when I do it. I do.
Consumers probably do too. I mean, as far as social validity goes, I would assume that would be an indicator, a positive indicator on like a social validity assessment, like having more choice in what your treatment looks like, essentially.
Yeah. And at what point do we start studying social validity as the primary dependent variable rather than some secondary DV we tack onto our interventions?
Well, I think that is what we need to do, because that's what's going to prevent us from being canceled as well. You know what I mean? Is we have the science, we know what we can and can't do and how to do it, and it's up to society to tell us what we can and can't use to get the work done. You know what I mean? If I'm not going to jump on any bandwagons or bring up any of the real controversial stuff that we've done in the past or done now, but if you have the choice in our work between someone who life could end, or you could use one of those techniques, we need society to tell us, are we allowed to or not, rather than just saying, no, I don't feel comfortable with it, or it's scientifically valid, so we should do it. And so I'm talking the most extreme version of that, but I think that we do need to make, follow the science. We have our principles, we know it works, but social validity needs to be put in the mainstream, because that's what's going to determine whether or not we're accepted as a science or not.
Yeah.
We're rounding out on an hour. I see in the chat that Taylor asked me to let her know when this started, and so Taylor, we started, and I'm sorry I missed your chat to us. Hopefully you're listening.
53 minutes and 48, 49, 50
Yeah.
seconds.
Yeah, I know. I totally forgot we had for those listening and watching, we have a new platform here. So there's a chat with some of our behavior analysts joining in. Taylor is laughing out loud. That's a good indicator that that's okay. Any questions from the audience? Feel free to hit Andrew up now before he has to go. But I'll leave kind of with the question. What you I mean, you kind of summed it up already, but in a nutshell, what can behavior analysts learn about assent from animal trainers?
So I'm going to kind of combine all this, and it may make sense and it may not, but here we go. Most often when people are working with animals, they study ethology, which is biological basis of behavior, right? What are the biological mechanisms? And oftentimes we poo-poo that, right? We're like, we understand genetics and environment are both important. We prioritize a lot of environmental things. Pragmatically, we can change those, etc. But do not downplay how great descriptive data those individuals produce. They observe behaviors in their natural environment. That is aligned with natural science. And what animal trainers do is animal trainers or animal ethologists, they create these things called ethograms, which are descriptions of behaviors that typically align with some phenomenon. And from these ethograms, they have topographies of all these behaviors and the conditions under which they've observed them. And this allows them to create response hierarchies of what are some behaviors to look out for that typically predict a stressful environment, that typically predict more aggressive behaviors. So, for example, in dogs, they talk about whale eye, where you start to see the whites of the eyes of the dogs, lip licking, where you'll see that the dog will begin to kind of stick their tongue out consistently in a non-normal way, right? You start to see things like yawning when the dog shouldn't be tired, tail between their legs, hair up. All of those things are predictive or have been documented and described that those typically occur before the dog will aggress. And you work with really good animal trainers, and they can watch videos of people being attacked by dogs that happen out of nowhere, and they're like, that dog gave me 10 different signs. Now, I love that. That's step one. Are we doing that with our clients? But we are functionalists. We are not structuralists. So that takes on some structural components, right? Because we're describing rather than looking at functional control. But it's a great way to start forming these response hierarchies of what we're looking for. Okay? Based on that, guess what? If you're going to negatively reinforce or positively reinforce problem behavior, do it at those early topographies. When the dog is lip licking, when the dog's tail's between its legs, when the dog is yawning. Now, structurally, we can't just, or functionally, we can't just look at topography of behaviors, okay? Because let's say, and Kyle, I'm going to use you as an example and just give the actual answer instead of being the smart guy that I know you are, okay? If I saw an animal walking furiously away from a larger animal, would we say that that animal is trying to get out of or avoid the larger animal?
I would assume so, yes.
Right? Me too. That's topographically. Now, we didn't do a functional analysis to really understand what's happening there. So that looks like it. So if we use the ethogram alone and topographies of behaviors alone, we'd say, okay, reinforce negatively that behavior. Now, researchers have done this study with chicks when studying the phenomenon of imprinting. And basically, there's
You mean the animal, right?
Yes. Yeah. Right. Baby little chicks, a little imprinting, right? So when chicks are born, it's said that the first item that they see, they imprint on and will always work to get that animal will follow, and it's a reinforcer, right? And that it's always going to move towards it to try to get it. Well, that's not technically true. What is inherited is the capacity to be reinforced by close proximity to the object that they saw. So what they did was anytime the chick tried to approach the larger object, that larger object was furiously removed mechanically from the chick. And anytime the chick walked away from the object was mechanically, furiously presented closer to the baby chick. Eventually, the baby chick learns to walk away from the situation. Topographically, looks like escape. Functionally, to gain access to close proximity to that object. So we also need to do a good functional analysis to understand what is the underlying control of the behavior that we're topographically saying may be indicative of an escape behavior. We cannot say just based on structure alone. So we have to do a good job functionally. And that also includes an appraisal of respondent behaviors, right? What is going on at the respondent level? What reflexes that are inherited phylogenetically may also be associated, or stimuli that also may be associated with those unconditioned stimuli that are eliciting these types of respondent behaviors? My heart rate is increasing. I'm sweating. My face is getting red. And then recognizing that those features may serve as establishing operations for behaviors that will terminate them, right? So we have to have a full functional analysis to really identify what assent is functionally. And in my opinion, I have not studied this, but by understanding the different conditioning mechanisms, phylogeny and ontogeny, right, and the structural forms and the scripted data from ethologists, I can really begin to get a good idea of what's going on. And I can't ever say that the wolf is stressed. I can say the environment may be stressful and promoting these sorts of responses, but that wolf, we don't know if it's stressed. It's not telling us. It doesn't have verbal behavior. Stress is a concept. We can measure cortisol and those sorts of things, but I can talk about the environment and say there's something in the environment that is promoting these behaviors. And then that's where the pragmatism comes in, because I can change the environment. I can change my reinforcer delivery. I like to call it softening the environment. If a child is engaging in escape maintain behavior, animal and escape maintain behaviors, the first thing I'm thinking as a behavior analyst, negatively reinforce it. Boom. The behavior's done. The child, the client, the animal is feeling better, I'm assuming. I'm feeling better because I'm like, okay, I need to stop. And I go into problem solving. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do differently next time in the environment to prevent that from happening? And I can use that ethogram and the hierarchy of behaviors to make sure I'm reinforcing at the very beginning link, the tongue flick, okay, the whale eye, the yawning. I'd much rather negatively reinforce that than when the wolf then is attacking me, and then I have to reinforce it. So I think we, can learn from these descriptive levels of behavior at the ethological level and bring in our functional science at both the operant and respondent levels to begin to answer the question of what truly is assent-based treatment.
Yeah, I'll say your description of that study really kind of reminded me, and I think you were involved in this back when we were in school, but the school consulting, and we had a student who would aggress, and everybody thought escape maintain behavior or tangible. We did the test where like, all right, here's two cards, you press green, or probably yellow and red or something. I don't know. One was to get scolded, the other was to get positive attention, and it hit the one to get scolded all day long because that was a positive reinforcer, even though everybody assumed they were actually delivering punishment. And so the same way you think it's escape maintain behavior, but it really was gaining access to that attention in the first place.
Yeah, 100%.
Andrew, thanks so much for being here. We this is our hour, so I'm gonna kind of cut us off here. We can keep talking after we cut
I'm
off.
going to say we're going to join it and do another hour real quick and argue about respondent conditioning. Is it really respondent conditioning, or is it operant? We'll jump into that today.
Know. I love that debate we have in our grad class, and they're like, "Why did you teach us these as distinctly different?" We're like, "Surprise!"
It was great having you here, though. Thanks so much, Andrew Bulla, Associate Professor of Psychology and Program Chair for Behavior Analysis Programs at Georgia Southern University. Thanks again, and we look forward to having you back someday.
Thank you both, and thank you to anyone who may be listening to this. I always find it so humbling and a privilege to be a teacher, and when people opt in to invite me to be their teacher, I truly think it's very remarkable, and I just never take it for granted. So thank you all for giving me the space to share what I've learned.
I think that's a big reason why we do these, is because we all enjoy teaching, but some of us can't handle the politics at the university level. So we just put it out there for people to listen when they want to.
Vicariously through you guys. So
yes.